There is a quiet contradiction unfolding in the background of modern life, so subtle, so normalized, that most people never stop to question it. We are living in what economists call the most prosperous era in human history. More goods, more services, more technology, more opportunity than any generation before us. And yet, something feels off. A man sits in his car outside a modest apartment complex, engine idling. He has a stable job, a respectable salary, a degree his parents could only dream of. On paper, he has done everything right. But inside, there's a quiet calculation. Running rent, utilities, groceries, debt payments. Numbers that never quite align. A life that never quite stabilizes. He is not poor, but he is not secure. And that distinction is everything. Because decades ago, this same man, this same level of effort, this same trajectory would have led somewhere very different. A house, a buffer, a future that felt predictable. So what changed? We are told that progress is linear, that each generation climbs higher than the last. But if that's true, why does it feel like the ground is shifting beneath our feet? Why? Does success feel more fragile the closer we get to it? Imagine a ladder, strong, structured, reliable. For decades, it stood as the symbol of upward mobility. Each rung clearly defined: education, career, home ownership, retirement. You climb, step by step, and eventually, you arrive. But now, something strange is happening. The ladder is still there. It looks intact. The rungs haven't disappeared. But when you step on them, they begin to dissolve. Not instantly, not dramatically, slowly, subtly. Enough that you don't fall, but enough that you never quite reach the top. And here's the unsettling part. Most people don't blame the ladder. They blame themselves. Maybe they didn't work hard enough. Maybe they made the wrong choices. Maybe they just need to try a little more. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the system itself has changed in a way that's almost invisible? Consider this: wages have increased over time. Economies have expanded. Global wealth has multiplied. And yet, the cost of living, housing, healthcare, education has outpaced it in ways that fundamentally alter the equation. So the question becomes unavoidable. If everything is growing, why does it feel like something is shrinking? If opportunity is everywhere, why does mobility feel like an illusion? If we are richer than ever, why do we feel poorer? There is a deeper pattern here, one that isn't obvious when you look at individual lives, but becomes undeniable when you zoom out. The middle class, the very backbone of modern economies, is not collapsing in a dramatic, visible way. It's not a sudden fall. There is no single event, no clear breaking point. Instead, it is something far more difficult to detect: a slow erosion, a gradual redefinition, a shift that happens so quietly, most people don't realize it's happening until they feel its consequences. And that raises a dangerous possibility. What if this isn't a failure of the system? What if it's the system working exactly as designed? Because when you start pulling on that thread, when you begin to question the assumptions behind growth, success, and stability, you uncover something far more complex, something engineered not for collapse, but for control. So the real mystery isn't whether the middle class is disappearing. It's something far more unsettling. What if the middle class isn't disappearing at all, but being quietly transformed into something far less powerful? To understand what is happening now, you have to go back to a time when the middle class wasn't fragile. It was foundational. The years following World War II were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Entire economies were rebuilt from the ground up. Industries expanded, infrastructure boomed, and for the first time in modern history, prosperity wasn't concentrated at the top, it spread outward. Factories didn't just produce goods, they produced stability. A single income could support a family. A modest job could buy a home. Education was accessible, not a lifelong financial burden. There was an unspoken agreement, a social contract, that if you contributed to the system would support you in return. This wasn't accidental, it was structural. Strong labor unions ensured workers had bargaining power. Governments invested heavily in public goods. Corporations operated with longer-term visions, not just quarterly profits. The result was a middle class that didn't just exist, it thrived, But systems built on balance are fragile, and in the 1970s, that balance began to crack. Inflation surged. Growth slowed. Confidence faltered. It was a period economists would later call stagflation, a rare and destabilizing combination of economic stagnation and rising prices, and in response, a new philosophy began to take hold: deregulation, globalization, market efficiency. On the surface, these changes revitalized economies. They unlocked growth, increased competition, and accelerated innovation. But beneath that surface, something more subtle was happening. Power was shifting. From labor to capital. Manufacturing jobs, once the backbone of middle-class stability, to disappear, replaced by service-based roles that were often less secure and less rewarding. Unions weakened. Bargaining power eroded. And then came shareholder capitalism, a simple but profound shift. Companies were no longer primarily accountable to workers or communities. They were accountable to shareholders. Maximizing profit became the central objective, and profit demanded efficiency. Efficiency meant cutting costs, and the largest cost in most businesses is labor. Here's the paradox. As productivity increased thanks to technology, globalization, and efficiency did not keep pace, workers produced more value than ever before, but they captured less of it. So where did the value go? It accumulated elsewhere within corporations, within financial markets. Within assets that were increasingly out of reach for the average person, generations began to diverge. Parents who lived through the post-war boom experienced stability, predictability, upward mobility. Their children entered a world of volatility, competition, and uncertainty. Same effort, different outcomes. And that's the crucial realization. The golden age of the middle class wasn't just a result of hard work or cultural values. It was the product of a very specific alignment of policies, institutions, and incentives, an alignment that no longer exists, which leads to an uncomfortable question. What changed behind the scenes to quietly turn it against them? The modern economy doesn't collapse the middle class. It manages it, not through force, not through visible constraints, but through mechanisms so embedded in everyday life that they feel natural, inevitable even. Take inflation. On paper, it's a neutral concept, the gradual increase in prices over time. But in practice, it acts as a silent transfer of wealth. Those who hold assets, real estate, stocks, businesses, see their value rise. Those who rely on wages fall behind. Because wages adjust slowly, prices do not. Then there is debt, student loans, mortgages, credit systems. These are often framed as tools of opportunity, pathways to education, home ownership, financial flexibility. And they are. But they are also something else. They are anchors, because debt doesn't just finance your future, binds you to it. It shapes your decisions, limits your risk, keeps you moving within a predefined path. You cannot easily step away from a system you owe. Now layer this with asset inflation. As central banks lower interest rates to stimulate growth, borrowing becomes cheaper. Capital flows into assets, housing prices rise, stock markets expand. Those who already own assets benefit, those who don't find themselves increasingly locked out, so the middle class faces a paradox. To secure its future, it must buy into the system: education, property, investments. But the more it buys in, the more exposed it becomes to the forces controlling those systems. It is like running on a treadmill that gradually increases in speed. You are moving forward, but never arriving. And then comes the shift in risk. There was a time when companies carried the burden of stability, pensions guaranteed retirement, jobs offered long-term security. Today, that risk has been transferred. Retirement is now an individual responsibility. Job security has been replaced by flexibility, gig work, contract, roles, temporary positions. Freedom on the surface, uncertainty underneath. Optimize better. But what if effort alone is no longer the determining factor? What if the system itself has redefined the rules in a way that effort cannot overcome? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The middle class is not just participating in the economy, it is fueling it. Its consumption drives growth. Its labor sustains production. Its aspirations keep the system moving. It is the engine, but an engine is not designed to escape. It is designed to run continuously, efficiently, indefinitely so. The question is no longer why upward mobility feels harder. The question is far more unsettling. What if all of these mechanisms, inflation, debt, asset pricing, risk transfer, are not isolated forces, but interconnected parts of a system designed to keep the middle class in a permanent state of almost zoom out far enough and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore? This isn't happening in one country. It isn't tied to one policy, one government, or one economic model. It's everywhere. Different cultures, different currencies, different political systems, same outcome, a middle class, under pressure. Globalization was supposed to create balance-lifting developing nations, while maintaining stability in developed ones, and in many ways, it did. Millions were lifted out of poverty. Entire regions transformed. But balance is rarely permanent. As companies sought efficiency, production moved to where labor was cheaper. Supply chains stretched across continents. Costs dropped. Profits increased. But so did competition, not just between companies. Between workers, a job was no longer competing locally. It was competing globally. And when labor becomes abundant on a global scale, its value declines. At the same time, central banks began playing a larger role in stabilizing economies. Interest rates were lowered. Liquidity increased. Markets were supported. But these policies had side effects. They inflated assets, housing, in major cities became less about living and more about investment. Prices rose beyond what local incomes could sustain. The result, a generation priced out of ownership. And this is where the paradox deepens. Global prosperity increased, but local stability decreased. Because while wealth expanded, it became more concentrated in assets that the middle class increasingly struggled to access. Add to this the influence of multinational corporations and international financial systems. Decisions made in one part of the world ripple across others. A policy shift in one economy affects employment in another. Capital flows freely across borders, but labor does not. So individuals find themselves navigating forces far beyond their control, competing not just with neighbors, but with systems. Invisible systems. And that creates a new kind of pressure. Not just financial, but psychological. Because when outcomes are shaped by global forces, local effort begins to feel disconnected from results. You do everything right and still fall behind. So, the question evolves. If this pattern is global, if it transcends borders and ideologies, it a flaw in the system. Or something far more intentional, because systems that persist rarely do so by accident, which leads to a deeper, more unsettling realization. What if this isn't dysfunction? What if it's design? There is a moment in every investigation when the question changes. Not what is happening, but why does it exist this way at all? Because what if the middle class, the idea of stability, upward mobility, financial independence, was never meant to be permanent? What if it was a phase, a necessary stage in the evolution of modern economies? Here's the uncomfortable perspective. A fully secure middle class is powerful. It has options. It has leverage. It can negotiate, resist, even disengage. But a middle class that is slightly insecure behaves differently. It works harder, consumes more, competes endlessly. It strives, and striving is economically valuable. This is the paradox. The system does not require the middle class to be wealthy. It requires it to be productive, motivated, and just uncertain. Enough to keep going. Not collapsing, not escaping, just continuing. Think about the narratives that define modern success. Education leads to opportunity. Hard work leads to stability. Home ownership leads to security. These are not false, but they are incomplete because they also serve another function. They anchor people to the system. They create long-term commitments, financial, psychological, emotional. And once you are anchored, you adapt, you adjust your expectations, you normalize the pressure. This is what can be called managed expectations. The system doesn't need to eliminate the middle class, it only needs to redefine it. Lower the threshold of what stability means, shift the baseline of what is acceptable, turn what was once temporary struggle into permanent reality. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, people begin to accept less as normal, less security, less ownership, less control. But here's the most unsettling part. Most people never realize this shift is happening because it doesn't feel like a systemic change. It feels like a personal challenge, something to overcome, something to fix. So they push harder, adapt faster, optimize endlessly, and in doing so, they reinforce the very system reshaping them, which leads to the darkest realization of all. What if the middle class isn't dying? What if it's being carefully redesigned into a permanent state of controlled dependence? If these patterns continue, the future does not arrive as a sudden collapse. It unfolds. Gradually, a slow reconfiguration of society, the middle begins. 2. Thin not disappear, but stretch. Fewer people anchored in stability, more hovering on the edge. A new divide emerges. Not just rich and poor, but owners,